Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, I'm delighted on behalf of the New Culture Forum today to welcome to the show David Frost, Lord Frost of Allington. You will know him as Britain's chief Brexit negotiator. Before that, he had a top-flight diplomatic and political career, including being ambassador to Denmark. He's also senior fellow at Policy Exchange, for which he has recently written a report on what the government might do in the coming years, which is called Holy Issues. Thank you very much for joining us, David. Thank you.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before we go further into anything particularly political, I wanted to ask you what your general reflections are at the moment on the past week. We're actually recording this on the Wednesday, and so the state funeral of the Queen was on Monday. What has it told you about Britain the past 12 days?
Yeah, it's been an amazing 10 days, obviously. It's shown, I think, that lots of people still feel, a very deep emotional loyalty and commitment to the monarchy, to the country, to the things that made this country what it is today, which I happen to think is a good thing. Yeah. And I think it's been a pushback against the conventional view that the country's declining, that its history doesn't mean anything, that all these things don't count. And we've seen concrete evidence that a lot of people in the country don't think that way, and it's very good.
Were you surprised?
I wasn't really. I mean, I think a lot of people do think like this, and when you get out of SW1, you find that very quickly. So no, I'm not at all surprised. I think it's very good that organisations and people who you might have thought would be a bit sceptic actually got with the programme quite quickly on this and understood the depth of feeling and actually began to reflect and think about it a bit. And yeah. I think that's a good sign.
I think, obviously we on the NCF are very much concerned with cultural issues. And from my point of view, it would seem that this was a strengthening exercise, actually. I liked seeing our history almost played out. I believe you were at one of the ceremonies, which was the Accession Council.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that?
So the one I was at was the parliamentary reception of the King and Queen, the formal presentation of addresses. And I wrote a little bit about it in the Telegraph column last week, and it's a remarkable occasion. The weight of history is extremely strong, and the sense of continuity. This is a very old country. Not many countries have got a historical continuity like we have as a nation state. Arguably France is maybe the only one, and we need to sort of respect it and show it and demonstrate it. So I think it's been very powerful from that point of view.
When you in that article in the Telegraph, I should add, of course, that you are a columnist for the Telegraph now as well. In that article, you talked about the extraordinarily successful duality of the monarchy and Parliament in our constitution. I mean, over a period of 300 years? Yeah,
I mean, I think our history is unusual from that point of view. Parliament, yes, was a check at various times, but more often it's been a partner of the monarchy. It's survived from the Middle Ages because it was an effective partner of the monarchy in governing the country, and over the last 300 years has gradually taken more and more of the powers that rested with the king for itself. And that process of evolution is quite unusual to Britain.
Yes. Well, politics is definitely sort of like elbowing its way in again now. Yeah. We're going to have the party conferences quite soon. And obviously we now have a new Prime Minister and new government. I wanted to turn to the extended essay, really, rather than report that you did for Policy Exchange, and which in some ways I think you do in fact point out at the beginning is not unlike a similar sort of set of recommendations that were developed for Margaret Thatcher when she was in opposition in the 1970s. Do you think we are in a comparable position now?
I think we are in some ways. I think there's the sense that I remember a bit from the 70s, although I was obviously fairly young, of the end of an era, that a way of doing things had reached its conclusion, and now we needed to go off in a different direction. And the 70s and Mrs. Thatcher marked the end of the post-war consensus way of doing things from Attlee and Macmillan and so on. And I think what we're seeing now is the end of the conventional wisdom of Blairism, Brownism, Cameronism, of the right way to manage the economy, and it was bound up with the single market, with EU membership. It involved a very particular view of how to run an economy, and we haven't particularly prospered in this over the last 10-15 years. And I think Liz Truss got the point that we need to go off in a different direction. I think one of the points that John Hoskins, who wrote that report you refer to, made very strongly, and he makes it several times in the report, is there is no point in doing things purely because they're politically possible if they don't solve the actual problems that you're dealing with. And I think that's something we really need to take forward over the next year or two. We must do things that are capable of solving our problems, even if they look politically difficult. Otherwise, we're wasting our time.
Don't you think, therefore, that we've become kind of addicted to short-termism, would you say?
I think politics often is short-term. I think we probably have got more addicted, I would say, to politics as kind of media manipulation. How do things look in the media the next day, the next week, whatever? And I think there's been a reluctance to make arguments from principle. And again, one of the things I say in this report is that we haven't talked about the principles of free market economics, how a capitalist society works, what the role of profit, free choice, all these things that make an economy tick. We've simply not really talked about that very much. We've been a bit embarrassed about it, and I think it's a very good sign, incidentally, that Liz Truss is not embarrassed by talking about some of these things.
You supported her, didn't you?
Obviously, I did, yes, in the campaign. And we've got to get back to talking about these fundamentals so people can understand. And actually, I think people are crying out for this. People want authenticity. They want debate about actual issues and things that are capable of changing things, and in different ways. I think the Brexit referendum and everything that followed with that caught that, but also Jeremy Corbyn caught that. He taps into people's wish for things to be done differently in a malign way, but he tapped into it, and we on the right must do the same.
Yes. I suppose you could say, in some sort of kind of hideous way, he was a conviction politician.
Yes, I mean, many of the worst politicians have been conviction politicians as well, it has to be said. So one needs to keep these things within limits. But you've got to stand for something other than just keeping the show on the road. And that's how it's felt, I think, in the last few years.
You start, actually, the essay with a quote from Orwell, who's really must be the most quoted of our writers over the past 5 years, I'd say. But we have sunk to a depth at which restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent man. What, if you like, do we need to restate then, economically to begin with?
Economically, we need to restate that the most prosperous countries are the countries that depend on free markets, free market capitalism, have freedom in the way they look at the world, and low taxes, letting people run their own lives, all these conservative nostrums produce prosperity. And I think there is a version of one of the things that slightly worries me at the moment is there's a version of politics on the right, the sort of red Tory or blue Labour, depending on where you're coming from, that seems to say we can get away from that. It's not as important as it once was. And I strongly disagree with that. If we don't anchor ourselves in an economics that produces prosperity and growth, we're going to have a problem. We're just storing it up. So those are some of the obvious truths that look around the world. It's obvious. The most successful countries are the ones that are free market, have freedom in their DNA, and allow people to experiment, prosper, and run their own lives.
Along those lines, economically, but also for that matter culturally, one of the biggest complaints we have, not least from our viewers, but I mean this is heard all over, is that here you had a nominally conservative government with a huge majority, which appeared to do very little that was conservative. Do you think it's fair?
I think it's fair up to a point. I think I would say there's been more of a sense of drift and inability to kind of reconcile different objectives. I think the situation we've got into is one where productivity hasn't grown for 10, 15 years. There was an effect on the economy as a result of leaving the single market and customs union. Obviously, there will be. Therefore, the most important thing is reform, growth, getting taxes down, and that should have been the priority. And I think what we saw was a kind of drift into levelling up, social measures, kind of trivial, almost virtual signalling measures like, food bans and this and that. And there wasn't a story, there wasn't an agenda that people could get behind. And I think there now needs to be. There needs to be a plan. There needs to be a clear vision of what we are trying to do as a party.
It's interesting because actually when Boris Johnson was elected, there did appear to be, at least at the beginning, a kind of very strong sense of what people could get behind. You obviously famously resigned from the government because one of the reasons being was that the benefits of Brexit were not being realised adequately. How much was this drift down to personalities?
I think, to be honest, I think, a lot of the things, to be fair, I think a lot of the things that are problematic were in the 2019 manifesto, which was composed in a very different moment economically and politically to the one we're in now. We didn't put a lot of emphasis on deregulation. Net zero is one of the 5 pledges. So is not increasing taxes. So I don't think it's so much about people. I think it's that the manifesto and the thinking reflected a world that was disappearing. It was the world of EU membership and all the debates that went with that. And we're now in a new world, and it took time to realise that. And I don't think the previous government collectively ever did. I hope this one will.
So, for example, the idea which you do touch on in this report of the nation state becoming stronger again, do you think we have strengthened at all? Do you think that idea has strengthened at all in the past 3 years?
Yeah, I think it has, and we are in various ways. I think we're taking more decisions for ourselves again, which is good. We're seeing politics come back into things that have not been particularly political. Trade policy, for example, entirely non-political subject 50 years, all of a sudden has come back to life with debates about food standards and who we want to be open to and all this sort of thing. So I think we're seeing some normal politics coming back. I think the debates around devolution and independence and the very specific problem with Northern Ireland are still as live as ever. I think one of the problems we've got is that the nation states become unfashionable. We don't really have the language to talk about it anymore in the same way. I think many people just see it as something from the past. And to be modern, you've got to be a bit doubtful about borders and believe in high levels of migration and be a bit sort of skeptical about national loyalty and so on. And we don't have the language for it. I think it's very interesting watching what's going on in the US and this sort of national conservatism movement, which in my view has some strengths but also some problems. But it's interesting they have taken the words nationalism and national, and I fear that's an irredeemably tainted word in Europe. We need a language that is about the nation state, nation statism, patriotism, loyalty, because the nation state is the best and most successful way we've found so far of allowing people to do politics and have different views within a common arena. Nobody's come up with anything better yet, and we need to hang on to it.
Yes. The national conservatism movement you talk about in America, would that be the same as what they call the new right? I think they've recently had a conference down in Florida.
Yeah, that's right. NatCon 3. I think there are some, there are different strands in that movement. I think obviously, and it's an attempt, as I see it, a bit to make sort of post-Trumpism kind of respectable. And I think they have tapped into a lot of things that are important. The need for sort of self-respect and self-esteem in a nation state, the need to have productive capacity, the need to kind of care about your history and culture and not see it kind of attenuate away, to be serious about borders. I think all that's really important. I think it does, at the fringes, it does seem to creep into nationalism that makes me feel a bit more uncomfortable at the edges. And of course, there is a particular relationship with religion and Christianity that is different in the US to the way things are here, and that gives it a different tone. But I think it's interesting that they're responding to some of the same needs and developments. I think in an American way.
Yes. In the holy issues, you also do mention various cultural aspects to what we have to do, and really, from the outside looking in, it is so rare that happens in conservative circles. It seems to me that, in fact, in my experience at least, what I see as a full-out, attack on Western civilization, too many people in the Conservative Party seem to see it as being sort of PC gone mad. They don't quite get it. Do you think that that's a fair judgment?
I think a lot of people see it as marginal. It's not that they don't share the opinion that history is important, culture is important, and that we should kind of stand up and protect and care about these things. I think they just see the phenomena as a bit marginal or a bit sort of peripheral to kind of normal politics. And I think that is beginning to change, because some of the phenomena are beginning to merge with each other. The assault on our history, the assault on biology is getting conflated with the free speech issue that itself became an issue during the pandemic, I think. So I think we are seeing some of these problems drift into mainstream politics. I do hope that this new government is going to tackle them a bit more seriously. I do myself think that the way to solve a lot of them is be serious about free speech. I'm not interested in closing down debate in either direction. I think our arguments are good arguments and win the day when they're given a fair hearing. And the government's role should be to protect the space for that debate and allow people to have it properly.
How would they do that best, you think, David? How would they do that? Because I think there's almost nobody who would disagree. Well, actually, having said that, when we look at younger people, it is alarming how actually they don't seem to care that much even about the concept, or many of them anyway. But given that most of us do, how would a government best do that?
Well, I think the constraint there already are too many constraints on free speech, in my view. There's obviously a sort of chilling effect from some of them at the margin that is discouraging debate. I think they should be the online safety bill, I think, should be withdrawn or massively rethought as a first step.
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
I would like to see, much clearer duties on institutions, not just universities, but government institutions generally, public sector institutions generally, to protect free speech, stand up for free speech, to make dismissing people on grounds of expressing a normal opinion not possible. I'd like to see clearer duties on social media companies, insofar as we can, to do the same thing. I think the whole trend at the moment is in the wrong direction. Unfortunately, that's going to mean the government standing up for people it intensely dislikes, who aren't particularly pleasant necessarily, and with whom they disagree. But if you don't do that, you're not really in favour of free speech. And those difficult cases are where things get tested. Look at the, go back to 250 years to the debates around the first reporting of parliamentary proceedings. That was very unpopular at the time, yet it happened. And you've got to stand up for unpopular things as well as the things you like.
Don't you think as well it sometimes comes down to just often people need to hear, just in speeches, they need to hear that people are on their side on these issues. I think that's what we seem not to have had very much of. And I think when I think of during the time where we had the BLM marches and the statues were under threat and they were coming down, it seems to have cooled down a bit since then. But there seemed to be a feeling that, ministers had to be goaded into saying something.
Yeah, again, I think it's one of these areas where, at least some of those responsible were trying to reconcile, basically irreconcilable objectives. So one day they said something that tilted in one way to the argument, and one day they said something that went in a different way. And I think you just can't. People have got the right to say, in my view, what they wish, unless they're inciting violence. Public institutions should not be taking sides in these debates like the police seem to at times. We need free speech, free debate. Let the best arguments win, and that's the best way through this. Incidentally, I think another thing that scares people off a bit is what seems to me to be quite a coarsening in the tone of our public debate in recent years. And I don't know whether social media is part of this, whether it's happened anyway, but the very aggressive language, the sort of foul-mouthed speech, the threats, the kind of sneering tone that is so much around, that seems to me to be quite new.
And that's just the MPs.
I think, a bit of courtesy, a bit of kind of decency in the way we engage these arguments. I think it's more a phenomenon on the left than the right, but you do see it on the right. I think a bit, let's all be a bit nice to each other. Maybe that will help. I
would agree with that. I mean, yes, rule number one would be don't go on Twitter, I suppose. But it seems to me that, I have got a bit of a dog in this fight, I suppose, but it does seem to me that it has come, that kind of hatred and virulence has certainly come from the left. I mean, when you go back to Brexit, and you still see it on Twitter, don't you? People disowning their parents and things like this. It's just appalling.
Yes.
It's just no humanity in it whatsoever. No. You mentioned that we've talked a bit about history. You mentioned there the attack on history. Again, I don't mean to sort of like land these things on you and you to come up with policy ideas, but how best to protect history? I mean, you do mention that one of the reasons that we've become demoralised is that there's been decades of chipping away. I mean, certainly in my lifetime, I suspect yours, that's all I really remember, and that is undermining, however reasonably sounding, and we end up in this position where the one we're in now. How can one possibly reverse or change that?
Well, I think there are a lot of things. I mean, obviously in schools, the government can reasonably impose a duty to expose all sides of the argument about Britain and its historical record. I mean, all sides of it, and I'm not convinced that is always happening at the moment. I think it can reasonably impose a duty to tell the whole sweep of British history, not just focus on sort of snapshots at particular moments, so that people kind of understand how we got to where we are. And again, I'm not sure that's happening. People often, seems to me, have quite a sort of weak understanding of some of the things that would have been common knowledge maybe 50 or 100 years ago. I think also we, the kind of very deeply rooted teleological Whig theory of history that we have in this country is in some ways it's part of the problem. That British history has been an evolution from monarchy into democracy, the growth of institutions. That is definitely part of the story, but it has enabled people to say, well, we're now, that process is still going on. The next phase is the gradual dissolution of the nation state into something else, into a world where borders matter less. That is the natural next development. And there, I think, you have to distinguish history from politics.
Yes.
History is how people responded to the trends, the developments around them when they were alive, and they took the decisions and acted, in accordance with morality, politics that prevailed at the time. You can't use that as a sort of moral exemplar for guiding yourself now. We're doing the same things, and I worry that history has become politics a bit, and it's important to try and distinguish the two. I would say. Yes. Doesn't mean you can't learn from history, but the past was different. They did things differently there.
Well, people seem to have been disarmed in that they no longer know, as you say, certain things you might have once taken for granted. So they actually don't really know what they're meant to be defending, particularly. They understand that something is sort of under attack, but they can't bring forth the words. It's very difficult to bring forth the words to defend.
Yeah, I think that is right. And again, it goes back to this point about nationalism, nation statism. What is it that we are defending and why? And I go back to the, we are defending a country that has evolved through history and a set of ways of doing politics that has proved to be pretty successful. And all that comes with a kind of emotion and colour and historical content that has got us to where we are. That's the sort of political science way of putting it, but I think it's true. And there've always been people who want to weaken that. I mean, Orwell himself is famously highly critical of left-wing intellectuals who won't stand for God Save the King and all that. That I think is it's always been part of our sort of politics. But I agree. We're ourselves, I think, even in this discussion, sort of struggling for the language that kind of makes it real to people, gives it a kind of emotional component that people can respond to.
I suppose in order to try and make it real, take for example the sheer incomprehension people feel at our big institutions, our museums and such like, taking on a political role, apparently, seemingly, decolonising, whether it's the British Library, whether it's the British Museum, right down to Kew Gardens. What should happen in those situations? I mean, should they lose their public money? I mean, if they go beyond their remit?
I mean, I think it is very difficult here. I mean, the government does have a bit of a bully pulpit in these matters to kind of stigmatise or otherwise particular behaviour. I mean, but it comes back to, I don't particularly want the government to tell the people at Kew Gardens that they can or cannot teach or behave in certain ways. I think that carries risks as well. And what's happening in our institutions is a symptom of something that's already quite deep in the kind of intellectual class, that it isn't a cause of it. we have to provide the space for people who think differently to be allowed to say it. So, I've no doubt there are people in Kew Gardens just don't want to. I mean, it seems unfair to take this example, really, because I love Kew Gardens, and I was at its Sussex outpost, Wakehurst, only yesterday. But people have got to feel empowered to speak differently. We mustn't have the sense that there's only one correct set of opinions, that set of opinions is the only thing that can be represented on the boards of our major institutions, end of story. That we've got to keep the space for debate and discussion.
Would you be part of this government? I believe that you've been asked, haven't you, if you would be, and you haven't accepted. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I don't want to go into the detail, but we had a couple of discussions, and I felt it wasn't quite the areas where I felt I was most able to kind of contribute. So we left it at that, and that's fine. I support the government as long as it's doing the right things, and it seems to be showing good signs of that at the moment. And I feel I can probably best support by sort of saying and kind of contributing to the public debate around it at the moment.
Although since you were negotiating Brexit and everything, your profile has become much wider, and you must be aware of people, a lot of people admiring the positions you've taken, not least on the climate, for example. That's the lack of a climate emergency. I think you must have got it in the neck for that, I'm sure.
I definitely have. I mean, I have a lot of support and a lot of criticism, and I mean, people have been kind enough to say they thought I ought to have some role and still should, but I that's sort of up to them.
Yes.
I don't think that my presence is essential to a Liz Truss government that is doing a lot of the things that I agree with. Right. So that's kind of how I would look at it.
Have you always been sort of interested in politics? Have you since when you were a kid? Were you?
Yeah, I was, and all through my life really, and I've my opinions have changed with time, as many people's have. And one of the reasons I went into politics, into civil service, diplomatic service, was it was a way of being in that world, if you like, without taking all the risks that a kind of real politician has to. But the reason I left was I got frustrated with not being able to say what I think and do what I thought. And you don't lose those constraints in other organisations, but it's particularly acute in the civil service, and that was the frustration that led me to move on in the end.
Well, when you first became interested in politics, were you what you might call an instinctive conservative, or not, or just interested in the whole procedure? So
I find, I mean, I was on the left when I was young, a student and at school and this sort of thing, and my opinions changed quite fast once I sort of hit the real world, I suppose. But I do think that one of the things I find frustrating about the left is that they seem to have abandoned a lot of the things that I thought ought to have been important to the left, and we've been talking about some of them. High standards in education, high standards in culture, belief in the nation state. Go back 30, 40, 50 years. Those were important parts of left-wing culture, of working class culture. You wouldn't find somebody like Ernie Bevin pouring scorn on any of those subjects, quite the reverse. And one of the reasons I moved on from the left, I think, is because the left itself seemed to have abandoned things that seemed like important to me in the way you run a country and a good society. And actually I think quite a few people on the left themselves feel some of that, and they've drifted. There's a phenomenon, I think, of people, left-wing people, intellectuals who think they are on the left, but aren't, and they haven't kind of acknowledged it to themselves yet. They've moved to the right because the things they thought were important, left-wingers and the Labour Party no longer do. But being on the left is so important to their self-identity, they can't quite acknowledge it. And I find that's quite revealing about what's important in politics to me.
Yes. Do you think, I mean, this is part of that really, but do you think that there was this extraordinary thing, wasn't there, where the Red Wall, sort of fell to the Conservatives, but it was such an opportunity. Do you think that is one of the things that has been completely wasted? It was kind of revolutionary, really, in many ways.
I think there are quite a few fallacies around about the Red Wall. Let's not forget that Mrs. Thatcher won a good chunk of what's now the Red Wall in the mid-80s. It's not quite as new or astonishing as people say sometimes, and she won it with an appeal to, getting control of your own life again from the socialist bureaucracies who ran it and told you didn't have any future other than sort of stay where you were and vote Labour. Now it's different now, but I think some of the appeal to run your own life, get on with things, prosper, is still important in the Red Wall as well as in the Blue Wall. I think we did tap into a kind of patriotism, belief in democracy, and belief that the referendum result obviously should be respected. I think that's really important. But I don't draw the conclusion that we won lots of Labour seats, therefore we need to have lots of sub-Labour policies to keep them.
Yeah.
People came over because they realised they actually had a different set of values somewhat, and the Brexit vote kind of legitimised people realising that. And we must give conservatism to people who voted Conservative, in my view. It's a mistake to go in a different direction.
Yes. And we talked a bit about history, but I just wonder, having been so involved in Brexit over the past years, what's your general view, David, of where it's going there? Not that one should care, but I think we sort of should care. Do you think it is an empire in decline, and the EU generally, regardless almost of Brexit?
I think it's getting exhausted as a project. You can see the believers still wanting to use every crisis to produce a further leap in integration, whether it's through the euro or the stability mechanism or whatever, or now it's let's get rid of qualified majority voting in foreign policy, Ukraine shows the need it, and so on. Each time you get that. But I think the kind of moral force of that has got a lot weaker over the years. And I think the reason is that integration has gone so deep in the EU now that it's touching the fundamentals of what it is to run a country or to be an independent country, and people in Europe can see that as well as anybody else. And the fact that migration's been such a big debate, and borders and so on, even the role of the court in the French election, a bit, all these things are there. So I think it's reached its natural limits or close to them in terms of integration. I don't think it's going to go much further. I don't think they'll be able to sort of admit that to themselves. I don't see it kind of unwinding much, therefore, for the same reason. I claim intellectual property slightly in being the first person to compare the EU to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which I did in a lecture in 2008. But I think it's still valid. It sort of works after a fashion, but they can't get the energy to go in any real direction. And just like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were as much a problem for their allies as a strength for them. And that I think we're seeing at the moment as well.
I think, do get hold of this report, Policy Exchange report, if you can, because it's fascinating, very, very interesting to read. There's one very specific thing you said, actually, David. I'd like you just to tell us why. and that is that the Equalities Act should be abolished. You're quite clear about that.
Well, I think the problem with the Equalities Act is that it bears more heavily on the public sector than on the private sector, though it hits both. There are a set of specific duties on public sector organisations, government, and all the others around it, to ensure that these certain protected characteristics are protected,
right.
and and in a very intrusive way. And of course, government's particularly vulnerable to judicial review and all the other stuff that goes around that. And what's happened is that we've seen this massive growth of internal bureaucracy that is aimed at protecting and ensuring diversity and ensuring the protection of all these characteristics. And it's one of the reasons why we've seen HR in the public sector grow hugely, why there appears to be this huge sort of diversion of effort to worrying about this all the time. It's not easy for the people who run the departments, whether they're ministers or the top civil servants, to say we're just not going to bother about it anymore because it's there in law. They can't not pay attention to some extent, and every time they don't, they're taking a bit of a risk. So I don't see any alternative but to actually weaken the legal duties and get them proportional again, so that the primary duty of government departments comes to be again doing the job that they're constituted for, and not worrying about the composition of the employees.
Well, actually, we had an interview on recently with one of our most popular for a long time, journalist called Juliet Samuel, who was talking about HR.
Yes.
And it really struck a chord with people, because obviously most people have come across HR in their time. And it was, as you say, this extraordinary way in which the aim of what they do is diverged completely from actually what they're meant to do, is to imposing another sort of form, or an ideology, one would say, actually.
Yeah, I think it's become like that in certain places. You do find good HR officers in the civil service and areas of kind of common sense where people kind of try and keep the show on the road without getting overwhelmed by all this stuff. But all the pressures are in the other direction, and it's one of the reasons why ministers have just found it so difficult to get a grip in this area, and why some civil servants at least seem to think they don't have to pay too much attention to ministers who disagree with them on it, because there it is in the law. But it's just a specific case of the general problem, that there's too much superstructure that is stopping people doing their job, and you see that in all sorts of areas. That's we've got a productivity problem. That is undoubtedly one of the reasons. Yes,
definitely. I know we've got to close in a minute. With history in mind, how do you think Boris Johnson will be remembered in history?
I think history will think more kindly of him than many people do at the moment. To be honest, to me, he is. I loved working with Boris. It was a moment of intense sort of psychological crisis, I suppose, when I had to do what I thought was the right thing and leave. And a lot of things that have happened in this country wouldn't have happened without him. Undoubtedly, we would still be in the EU if he, and I think without blowing our own trumpet too much, me and Dominic Cummings had not been in these places at the right time. I think we would still be in the EU, and he deserves huge credit for that. For all the criticism on the pandemic, which I've been quite prominent in, nevertheless, we didn't get lockdowns like a lot of other countries got them. We did come out of them first. I think Boris was always a bit uncomfortable with it. I just wish he trusted his own judgment a bit more on that. And he saw the moral urgency on Ukraine. To me, it's a real, he was a great man brought down by a tragic flaws, really, things that people could see he should do something about, but somehow never could, and in the end caught up with him. But he should have realised that you can't give your enemies too much ammunition, and unfortunately carried on doing that. So I think, looking back, this is obviously going to be a hugely important, pivotal period in the history of this country, and he has been at the heart of that. He's put the country onto a new course. Sadly, he's not there to help steer it, but that's politics, and I'm sure we've done the right thing.
Also, there's no question that the kind of collectivism that you talk about has been embedded further by the pandemic, actually, hasn't it?
It really has, I think, and I think we're just beginning to realise the kind of psychological, cultural, political effects of it, which have gone quite a lot deeper than people thought. I mean, it had a big effect on me, and I think people have been reflective about it and often said the same thing. I realised governments could do things that they, in the past we thought they couldn't, and the whole way free speech in practice got restricted on certain issues, the whole inability to kind of debate certain facts honestly, I found extremely troubling, and it's a huge relief that we've got out of it, but unfortunately I don't think these things have been quite put back in the bottle yet. And it's been another turn of the handle to take us in a more collectivist direction, and it's so important this government says stop.
David, thank you very, very much for joining us and giving us your time, and do hope that you are up there in government at some point, whatever happens.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That's it for So What You're Saying Is this week. We shall see you next time. Thank you very much. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.